Hello, everyone. Welcome back to day 2 of After Orthodoxy. We are so excited to have you join us. My name is Julia Rothkopf. I'm the Public Programs Associate at YIVO. And yesterday we had a full day of this conference and the festival. We had musical performances, comedy, poetry, and lots of talks, all very illuminating. And it really occurred to me and my colleagues who work at YIVO just how important this history is to YIVO and how it relates to our current collections in our stacks in our library. So thank you all for being here. Today, Naomi Seidman is unfortunately not here, so we are going to start with a panel about the changing face of OTD, and Jessica Roda kindly stepped in to moderate, and then we will do a panel on going back to where you came from, and then we will conclude with some closing remarks from Zalman Newfield. So thank you everyone for joining, and we are so happy to have you back.
Great. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for the introduction. So my name is Jessica Roda. Maybe you wonder why I'm here also. So I know those wonderful panelists this morning. I wrote a book about ultra-Orthodox female artists and the one who left. It's called For Women and Girls Only. So maybe we'll have a great conversation about the changing face of OTD. And before getting started into the conversation, I'm going to present our 3 wonderful panelists, and I'm going to read, because even if I know all of them and their great work, you know, it's important to have it right. So first of all, we have Jessica Lang. So she's a professor of English and the dean of the George and Mildred Westman School of Art and Science at Baruch College. Her areas of specialization span early American fiction and Jewish American and Holocaust literature. Her numerous publications include Textual Silence, and the book Of the Derech, Living Orthodox Judaism. Dr. Lang is the founding Newman Director of the Baruch Sandra Kahn Wasserman Jewish Studies Center. So welcome, Professor Lang. Then we have, it's falling apart, Miriam Moster. So Miriam Moster is a visiting assistant professor of sociology at Wagner College. Her dissertation, entitled Inadvertent Exit, Divorce in the Haredi Community, explores the relationship between divorce and religious exit among members of the Haredi community. She holds a PhD in sociology from the Graduate Center CUNY and an MFA in creative writing from Hunter College. Welcome, Professor Moster. I'm bringing all the title. Okay, I'm going to try to put that here. It's going to be a little bit annoying. And our last and wonderful panelist and organizer also of this great conference with Naomi Seidman, Schneur Zalman Newfield. He's an associate professor of sociology and Jewish studies at Hunter College, City University of New York, and the author of the book, Degrees of Separation, Identity Formation While Living Ultra-Orthodox Judaism, published in 2020. Newfield is also a host on the Jewish Studies channel of the New Books Network podcast and the founder of the Bridge to College Initiative, a Hunter College pilot program designed to assist those lacking formal secular education to acclimate to the college environment. So welcome to our 3 panelists and welcome to the audience here and on Zoom. So the questions that we have today to engage in the discussion are a lot about indeed change and the relationship between the OTD community and the Haredi community. And I would like to start by entering this question about the transformation of the Haredi community throughout the year, especially when you started your own research. How do you see the response of the Haredi community internally transforming regarding the idea of religious deviance, religious doubt, and also the idea of people who do not fit in? And here, when you think about Haredi community, it's a big, category, but what are the transformations that you have seen, throughout the years? So maybe we'll do a little, yes.
Okay, so I'll talk about 2 areas where I've seen this. One is in my dissertation research, things that I've come across, and the other is I recently designed a survey for a collaborative project between Shtetl, a news agency that covers the Haredi community, and Nishma Research, a research agency directed by Mark Trencher. And this survey asked people a whole host of questions about their experience in the Haredi community and exiting the Haredi community. And what was unique about this is we surveyed both Haredi insiders and the people who left, so we can look at their responses comparatively. And one of the questions we asked them was, do you think the Haredi community has changed in the way it responds to basically deviance in the Haredi community? And I'll tell you, I noted the results to be able to share with you. So they had three options. Do you think the Haredi community has become more inclusive of people who are deviant and less shunning of them since about 5 years ago? Do you think they've stayed mostly the same? Or do you think they've become less inclusive of people who are deviant and more shunning of them? And among people who are Haredi, nearly 2/3 thought that the Haredi community has become much better, much nicer, and more inclusive. But surprisingly, even among people who leave, nearly half of them, 48%, shared that they also felt that the Haredi community is more inclusive today than they were 5 years ago. And then among ex-Haredim, nearly half thought they stayed the same. It was 46%, and about a third of Haredim thought they stayed the same. And only 6% of former Haredim and 2% of current Haredim thought that the community had grown any worse than it was 5 years ago. So there's certainly a feeling among both the people who leave and the people who stay that the community is warming to deviance and treating it differently. And this is something that I've also seen on the ground in my research. So I'll give you an example. It's the case study of New Square. New Square, as many of you might know, it's a village up in Rockland County. It's a very insular village. Of all Hasidic sects, it's one of the most insular there is. And in New Square, there was a really famous and really horrifying and sad suicide case about maybe a decade or a little more ago of a woman who got divorced. She left the community. She was shunned, alienated from her kids, and she ultimately committed suicide. And we're not hearing these kinds of stories. And this was like almost like a typical, not typical. New Square's, I mean, suicide is not typical, but the shunning, the degree of shunning was more typical back then that we saw, especially from New Square. So they were always more extreme than other sects. But over the course of my research, I was interviewing people from the New Square community, and they were telling me that in recent years, things have changed. And I tried to understand why things have changed. And what I learned was that New Square had outgrown its space. There just wasn't enough room for the people who lived in New Square to keep living there. And so they started creating new rules. In the past, if you exhibited any deviance, you were shunned because they were keeping their community really pure. And they had enough room for everybody. So you either stayed and you towed the line perfectly, or you were cast aside. And then, as they started outgrowing their space and there wasn't room, they needed a way to manage this kind of space problem, right? So they have more people than they have space for. And now, instead of saying you want to leave, you're shunned, like before in the past, if you wanted to even leave outside the borders of New Square, your family would become very disconnected from you, even if you wanted to stay religious, even if you wanted to stay skver. And there are skver outposts. There are other skver communities. New Square is skver Hasidic outside of New Square. But if you left New Square, the village, you would be shunned, even if your intention was to remain religious. And then as they outgrew their space, suddenly they need people to leave the village. So now they're managing deviance in a different way. Instead of shunning, they're actually trying to encourage people to move to these more moderate outposts. Now, by moderate, it's still extreme. They're still Hasidic, but they're more moderate than New Square, which is more extreme than most Hasidic sects. So, I mean, this comports with, can I get a little into the literature, the academic literature? So Kai Erikson is a sociologist who has a theory of deviance, and he says that societies have a certain capacity for deviance, and you kind of see deviance staying kind of consistent at that threshold because they have a certain capacity for managing it. And he gives the example of prisons. When you run out of space in your prisons, you have to redefine crime because you have no more place to put them. And that's what he was studying a Puritan society. And you kind of see this happening here. It's kind of the opposite. When you run out of space for the good people, you have to redefine deviance too. And that's what you see happening in New Square. And you see something similar happening in the Litvish community, but in a different way. They're managing their space crisis differently. So in the Litvish community, what I'm finding is they're running out of spaces in their schools. So they have a capacity problem there, and they're almost like they have these limitations. You can't accept everyone, and they're almost creating a deviance problem in the Litvish community because they don't have enough space for their own. So who are they going to exclude from their high schools? Who's not going to be accepted? In a way that kind of creates a deviance problem. You're kind of branding these kids, not giving them a space. So I think the changing face of acceptance in these communities, or the changing relationship, a lot has to do with the capacity of these communities, the amount of resources and amount of space they have for their own, that's motivating these shifts.
That's really fascinating. When I think about this question, I'm reminded of the analysis that I wrote about in my book, looking specifically at the Lubavitch and the Satmar community and what happens to people who change their religious status in some way, and how do those communities respond to them. And as I noted in my research, that there's a stark difference between how Lubavitch and Satmar deals with this issue. And basically, the Satmar community is a lot harsher in their response, but that what I found, and I should note, given they're talking about the change in the in attitudes and responses over time. So my research is based on data that I collected about, well, at this point it's about I guess about 10 years ago. So I do think that things have changed in the interim. So again, what I found was that both communities were very hostile towards people who were leaving, but that Satmar was more severe in its response. And I would say over the past, over the intervening period, things have definitely gotten better. But I think that there's a complicated dynamic here, because certainly from the perspective of the Orthodox or ultra-Orthodox community, I think there's an attempt to say, look, we're so loving, we're so kind, we're embracing the people who are deviating religiously. We, allow our family members to come back home and visit, and we stay connected to them or whatever. So the point is that I think we have to realize that this, there's empirical questions, what is going on in the ground, but at the same time, there's rhetorical posturing that's happening as well. So, and the rhetorical element of it, or the sort of the discourse around this issue, gets very complicated because everyone has different motives at play. So again, the ultra-Orthodox community, both for internal consumption and certainly when they are talking to outsiders or talking to the media, they have a certain interest in trying to present themselves in a very positive way that shows how flexible they are religiously. And then I think in a way the motivations become even more complicated when we think about the ex-Orthodox community itself. On the one hand, I think that a lot of people who leave, that I call exiters, a lot of them have a deep desire to stay connected to their families in some way. But I think that because a lot of people who leave the ultra-Orthodox community were in some ways traumatized by their experience in the ultra-Orthodox community and their experience leaving it, I think in some ways, some people, some part of the Exeter community also has a kind of interest in highlighting the ways that they're still disconnected or still not embraced to the extent that they want to be. So it becomes very complicated, in other words, to really get at the empirical situation. But I definitely think that things are improving. I think, but so for instance, some ex-Orthodox Hasidic people talk about, are excited about the fact that one of the big Hasidic Rebbes recently came out and told his community that it's important to embrace the members of their community who have left. We shouldn't shun them. We should, love them, and so on. And so some in the ex-Hasidic community look at this as a positive sign and say, oh, wow, things have improved so much. And then others take a more cynical view and say, well, maybe this whole kind of warm and fuzzy campaign is really just a subtle or not so subtle attempt to try to do kiruv, to try to do outreach on us, to try to kind of get us back. So which is it? I don't know. But the point is, I think that it's worth both noting that a major Hasidic Rebbe came out and said something like this, but also to think about the possible motivations for him or for the members of his community in engaging in this kind of friendly approach towards the ex-Hasidic community, knowing full well that the Hasidic community itself fundamentally does not accept the personal religious decisions that its former members have made, and that fundamentally they would like them to come back. So we need to keep all of these aspects in mind as we analyze the shifting approach of the ultra-Orthodox to its former members.
Thank you. I'm going to kind of translate the question into my particular lens, which is literature. And as Zalman was talking, I realized there's a mechitza here between the sociologists and the literary folks. So, but that's okay. Oh, you're anthropology. Well, you do film too, so you're an arts person. I'm gonna count you as one of mine. So, you know, as a literature scholar, we like to look at long trends, so not 5 years, but like 50 years, in order to really, it takes like most people 5 years to write a novel. So like that's not extraordinary. So that feels a little too quick. So I wanted to just identify probably, and people may be a little astonished to think of these works as off the derech, but I'm going to go for it. And in the mid-20th century, so in the 1950s, 1960s, the two most popular, let's call them off the derech, works of literature were Chaim Potak's The Chosen, which came out in the 1960s, and Elie Wiesel's Night, which came out initially in the late 50s and then went through a couple editions and really took off in the second half of the 20th century. And I think you all know, like Oprah, it's remained on the bestseller list for decades. And if you just look at these two volumes, one's fictional, one's memoir, and think about the authorship and the position of the author to the story they're telling, it's a very kind of traditional model of narrator. It's what we might consider conventional, right? It's a man narrating stories about either himself or a version. With Potak, it was somewhat autobiographical, about other men. Engaging. One went through the Holocaust, so a major crisis of faith brought on by global events. The other, it was a familial thing, and there's a whole discussion with Potak and that kind of dialectic between modernism, modernity, and religious practice. And the upshot for both was a departure from the belief system of the community of origin. And if you look 50, 60, even 70 years later to the current body of literature that we now identify as off the derech, it looks really, really different. And that's really the point I want to make, about just larger literary trends. We have queer people writing. We have many more formally published memoirs written by women than men. And I think they're really interesting. I think that's an interesting question, is to ask why. Women tend to be kind of more on the inside of these communities, of ultra-Orthodox, Orthodox communities. And then they go public with a memoir. I mean, it's really, an exposure to a degree that, they never have experienced while they're in their community of origin. We have, it's documentation that people are writing oftentimes as they are en route to departure, right? There's all sorts of different phases of exiting, and Zalman's written a fantastic book about the sociological processes. But often we're now seeing that technology offers a means for exiters to kind of document through blogging, through different kinds of diaristic impulses, their phases of departure. And there's an interesting story written by Frida Wiesel, a kind of graphic memoir, very short, where she documents exactly this and the influence of technology. So while I completely accept your argument that the communities, like the native communities, ultra-Orthodox communities, have become more receptive, I also want to say that people have become more outspoken as our society has shifted as well. We are sympathetic to protagonists who leave their communities because they identify in a way as profoundly different, whether it's because of how they identify or because of the kind of life they want to lead or profession they want to hold. We as a society have evolved as well, and publishing has evolved, like the whole industry has evolved. I want to make one more comment about a moment of stasis that I think endures, and that is the fetishization of the ultra-Orthodox community. We just love reading about these people. And there's a long-standing, if you go back, even you look back at 16th, 17th century literature globally, there's a fascination with the Jews, the conversion of the Jews, the secularization of the Jews. And I think that the public marketplace, which drives much of the reading material that we have available to us, also plays a really important role in this. And if anything, the success of this, really rich body of literature, which I think of as a new turn to American Jewish literature, off the derech memoir and storytelling, also speaks to a desire that I think is like hypersexualized and like intrusive and lurid in many ways. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing, by the way, but let's just acknowledge that it exists regarding these stories, the stories that they generate coming out of ultra-Orthodox communities about what goes on behind closed doors in ultra-Orthodox communities, the kind of insularity that's being exposed. So there's a real marketplace feature to this as well. And Potok and Wiesel to some degree as well, Potok definitely tapped into that very early on. So I'll stop there.
Sorry, if I could just add one thing to your last comment, because Naomi Seidman is not here with us today, but she wrote a wonderful review of the Netflix show Unorthodox for her reviews in the Jewish Review of Books, and she basically highlighted this point and kind of flipped the script, where for some time now we have all of these memoirs about sort of sexual experiences, sexual abuse, and so on, sexual discovery from ex-Orthodox people. And she basically said, well, we've been focusing so much on the ex-Orthodox, and then by extension on the Orthodox community itself, but we haven't spent any time looking at the people who are doing the looking. And she talks about like the secular society is like at the peeking through the keyhole of the Orthodox community voyeuristically, gazing at them. And she talks about the secular gaze. What's happening with the secular community? What are they getting out of all of these sexualized portrayals of the Orthodox community, of the ex-Orthodox members? And she talks about how these types of narratives feed into a kind of secular triumphalism, that says essentially the secular community was right all along. Of course, being secular, being atheist, whatever, is the right way. Of course, the religious are backwards and benighted, and what better way to reinforce this? Hey, look at these quote unquote escape narratives of the ex-Orthodox and see how much they suffered when they were in the community, how they suffered when they were trying to leave it. Obviously, we're right and the Orthodox community is wrong. And so I think, obviously, as scholars, as social scientists of all different stripes, we're keenly aware that all actors in any social context have motivations, have desires, have agendas. But I think that when we look at the sort of popular literature on the ex-Orthodox phenomenon, it's easy to forget this and just kind of focus on really minutely the experience of the ex-Orthodox without asking, why are these particular kinds of narratives being promoted, being published, being celebrated, as opposed to the plethora of other types of narratives that go, unnoticed.
just wanted to make two comments on the, because I think it's a very interesting conversation about the portrayed and the feed narrative. I think on and because this question is about changes in terms of the Haredi, I think also the OTD community, I mean, this institutionalization also of a community, instead of having, individual narrative, has also drastically changed. And this constant dynamic between both sides, and in terms of the trajectory that everybody is trying to make to convince, we are all trying to convince ourselves when we make choices in our life that we are making the best choices. And then we do that as community and as group. And I think everybody is doing that. And those narrative of fetishization, can you help me? Fetishization, you also have it in the frum world, in the Haredi world, in terms of how the secular world. So there's kind of this back and forth on looking at each other. And by looking at each other, I think, and that's for later about the representation in the media, this is also how changes occurred, right? I think that by observing how people are talking about ourselves at different levels, encourage, and also through different medium, encourage, community or individual to make transformation. And I wanted to say something about how the community also changed. What is fascinating is to see how many, diversity within the community, to make sure that also people will not necessarily completely draw the line of, becoming, fully secular or rejecting everything. And that's something, I don't know what you think about that, but the number of organization also within, and also in terms of the popular representation, the diversity, as you said, also of voices. And in a way, also sometimes to say, I'm able to stay in and to have this life of navigating the multiple worlds, the in-between worlds. I don't know what you think about that.
I'll pick up on that. So this is definitely something that we're seeing more of, people being deviant and still being included in the community, included in the family much more. And I think a big part of this goes back to what I was saying about capacity. Like at a certain point, when your deviance levels, your numbers start rising, you're either going to label everyone deviant and have a lot of outsiders, or you're going to change your definitions and keep them on the inside. But it also is important in the way this is actually happening on the ground and how that's transforming the community itself. So there's more openness inside. I don't know if we have any Mishpacha magazine readers in this audience, but I do sometimes read the Mishpacha magazine, and it really gives you an insight into the inner thinking of the religious community. So probably within the last month, there was an article written by a mother in Mishpacha magazine about her son, and her son stopped keeping, and at first she tried to crack down, and she talks about how harsh she was within her family and so afraid other kids would leave, and this fear. And then at some point she transformed, and this really mirrors a transformation within the community itself, and started noticing, okay, my son is not keeping this and that and the other thing, but look, he's really kind and he helps around the family. And I mean, I'm not representing the story perfectly because I didn't just read it, but maybe it was he's still davening, or he still sometimes wears tefillin or something like that. He's still keeping some things. So it's this kind of fluidity of the religious identity that's becoming more acceptable, and allows them to embrace the kids who are leaving, allows kids to tell themselves, I'm not keeping this, but I'm still on the inside. It's this different way of looking at deviance that we see taking place. There was another Mishpacha magazine article around Shavuos time. It really gives you a window into the inner workings of the Haredi mind and the Haredi family and the Haredi social unit. This one was about a woman who got married. I think her husband was at first in kollel when she first got married, or at least learning very regularly. And then over time, he stops learning as much. He's not learning Torah as a vocation. And she realizes he's not even keeping Sidarim. He's not even really learning every day. So he's getting together with his chavrusa, with his study partner, and they're just chatting. It becomes a social hour for them. And when she picked up on that, it was really harrowing for her at first. But then over time, she made peace with it. This is her husband. And she said that she still lets Shavuos, the holiday of Torah, be the time that she mourns the life that she thought she would lead. But she realizes she has a husband who keeps all the mitzvos, who helps her, takes care of her kids, who's observant in every other way. So, and again, it's the same kind of fluidity that you're seeing, or this balance that people are reaching, where it might not be this perfect life, this perfect kollel Torah life maybe that she envisioned, or this perfect child that the mother thought she would raise, but they're okay with that gray area now. There's more acceptance of that.
So if I may add, and it combined with Jessica Lang's also transformation in novel, as long as also there is this keeping the traditional structural model of family, I think, or the don't ask, don't tell. But what is interesting in and it goes back to also with what's happening in society, you know, in general. If you want to be queer, you can't. You know, that's very, very, and also the difference between being public. You know, the novel of Sarah Glass is a great example. Being public about your sexual identity, or being in the closet about your sexual identity, and how long are you maintaining that? And this transformation of the publicity of recognizing or accepting different types of family. And I'll let you, and then I will ask the second question actually about family structure.
If I could just add on to what Miriam was saying, and we touched on this, I think, in different ways in panels yesterday, but I think it's always, anytime we're talking about the ultra-Orthodox or Orthodox community and, you know, ex-Orthodox people, I think it's really worth remembering that these are all moving targets, right? So when I, you know, like I said, I collected my data on the Satmar and Lubavitch exiters, people who left those communities about 10 years ago. Lubavitch has changed in the past 10 years. So has Satmar, for all sorts of, you know, based on internal dynamics, based on external dynamics. Miriam is mentioning about New Square and some of the spatial issues and housing and things like that. But all these communities have different, you know, dynamics that they're dealing with, and they're evolving. So, of course, as scholars, as researchers, we're going to continue to analyze and think about and talk about these communities. But we have to always remember that these communities are changing. And so, yes, there's a greater openness to ex-members of these communities, but these communities themselves internally have gone through all sorts of changes over the past decade, let's say. I remember when I was growing up in Crown Heights in Brooklyn in the Lubavitch community, 30 years ago or whatever, it was like a real taboo thing for boys to learn English, to learn secular subjects. It's still a very big issue, and there's organizations that are trying to improve the situation, but there certainly are families that are providing some modicum of secular instruction to their own family members on a regular basis. I remember being struck that recently I went to Mendy's, which is a restaurant on Kingston Avenue, sort of in the heart of the Crown Heights community, Lubavitch community, and the Mendy's, which is a very kosher meat restaurant. They had a big publicity that you could get, I don't know, some kind of cold cuts or chicken fingers or whatever it was, some platter for the Super Bowl. And here come, you could get, you know, Mendy's Super Bowl package. And I was shocked. I was there with my daughter, and I gave her a half an hour speech about it. Like, this is unheard of. I mean, when I was a kid, having a television was this a taboo thing. I mean, people had televisions. My family had a television. There were all sorts of rules about what we were allowed to watch and when and whatever. But the point is that the Lubavitcher Rebbe was vehemently opposed to his followers having televisions. He said having a television is like bringing the church into your house. It was this terrible thing to do, you know. And so people may have had a television, but they didn't talk about it. It was shameful. I remember one kid, a bully, when I was in yeshiva, wanted to really make fun of me, so he told the whole class that Newfield has a television. And this was like a terribly embarrassing thing for everyone to know, that Newfield's family watches TV, you know. And now Mendy's has a huge poster saying, hey, you know, come get the buffalo wings for the Super Bowl. Like, again, this is not, you know, secular education per se, and it's not necessarily dealing with ex-members or whatever, but these things, of course, are all interrelated. And the fact that the Lubavitch community in the heartland, we're not talking about in the periphery in some outpost somewhere, we're talking about the Lubavitch heartland itself changing its standards and its, you know, what it considers acceptable culturally and socially. And I think this has obvious impacts on how it treats its ex-members and how where is the line in terms of how modern you could be while still being an upstanding member of the community?
I'll just chime in very briefly. Just to say, I completely agree with everything, but I do think that there are hard limits. We do not see queer families in Haredi communities. You know, people who want to live publicly as a same-sex couple. There's lots of records and documentation of queerness being underground and existing in these communities and has been for centuries. But you just don't find families, 2 dads, 2 moms living openly in the Satmar community. And so yes, like TVs are, and you can watch football, all male violent sport, but loving queer families, still we haven't evolved, and I don't see any suggestion that will be acceptable in the near future. And I just raise this because one of the there's a core group of memoirists and writers who identify as queer coming out of ultra-Orthodoxy, documenting, really painful struggles, but also a kind of celebration of their queerness, of their differences. And there's amazing advocacy and support groups that have been built around this community, able to offer them support now, more publicly. So that's been a shift, but within the community, not so much.
And I would say it goes back to the idea of the family and the family structure, because the same thing, you need to have large families, right? This model of, select, okay, I want 1 or 2 kids, or maybe I don't want any children. As a choice, that's not something that it would, so this is always this question, as long, all those, the question of practice, religion. I remember having this fascinating discussion with Shulam Din, like this understanding that the fact that he was not religious was not necessarily, something that was a core, but that it became an excuse as long as it's not public. And the other aspect is also as long as you keep the family, you can push, but there are certain limits. If you push towards a different model, of family structure and dynamic, then there is, and I would say maybe divorce is also part of this, and you're working on that. So maybe now the second question would be actually about family dynamic, and even in terms of the OTD community, people leaving the community and the family that decided to have, and the correlation between the acceptance on the choices that they make in terms of their personal life and their level of acceptance. So that on one level, how do you see the transformation between the relationship between both? And the second question is about internal relationship also, if you've seen, and maybe also in the literature and the representation, one parent or one person who is completely publicly non-religious, not in the closet, saying publicly and in front of the parents, the kids, sorry, and the other who stays, frum. Is it something that is possible? Or did you see it as kind of recognized and accepted?
Yeah, I'll start. This goes exactly to the heart of my research. So I'm happy to talk about it. I studied divorce in the Haredi community, and so divorcees have a much harder time leaving because they're breaking apart a family unit, which is so integral to the Haredi way of life. And another difference between divorcees who leave and the typical exiter that leaves and has this easier time and is more accepted is their position in life. So when a teenager leaves, they're leaving, a teenager who's being rebellious, they're not as much a threat to the system. When a young adult leaves, they're not as much a threat to the system. It's just one isolated exiter. They're not breaking apart a family. They're not breaking apart the structure. And the other thing is, at that time in their life, there's less control over them, especially for young adults, right? They're out of the Haredi school system. If they're not yet married, they're kind of at loose ends. They're not as moored and anchored in Haredi life. as the young child who's really rooted in the school system under parental control, under school control, or the young or growing family. So the school is a really central feature of Haredi life. It's a locus of both control and socialization in Haredi life, and not only for the children enrolled in the school, but for the entire family. Schools have rules. They give out rule books, guidebooks in the beginning of the year, and these handbooks have rules for the children who attend the school and for the parents who send their kids to that school. So often, like even though the community is tolerant of deviance among the teenagers, the teenage population more, and the young adults, if they keep them in long enough that these kids get married, then at some point they're sending their kids to Haredi schools, and they again become under the control of Haredi authority, and they become reincorporated in that way. So that's the key distinction you see. And it's also why you see a much harsher response when families try to leave or when families break apart and one parent tries to exit. Because now they're already under the domain of this religious structure, of the school structure. And then it becomes much harder to exit, and the community becomes much less tolerant of deviance in those situations.
I'll just add that, so I mentioned previously that the Satmar community, I found in my research that the Satmar community responded more harshly to people leaving than the Lubavitch community. One of the ways that I document this has to do with divorce and, well, with child custody coming out as a result of divorce. And so basically I found that in the Satmar community, if one parent stayed in the community and one parent left, often the parent that left would find that the entire community lined up to support the parent who stayed. And so they would provide financial support for lawyers, for just, the maintenance of the family, in order to show the court that the parent who stayed is not only religious, but is the best parent. They're able to take care of the children and have full custody of the children. Whereas the parent who left, the community would often hire investigators to find them doing something that seemed disreputable or chaotic or unstable or whatever, to show the courts or to claim for the courts, oh, look, this person is mentally unbalanced and shouldn't have custody. And my research, I found that the Lubavitch community did this much less often, but that the Satmar community, this was sort of par for the course. This was for the people, the ex-Satmar people that I spoke to, they basically expected their community to come out and support the parent who stayed. So, and as Miriam said, that like once the issue of children came into play, the community felt that they sort of had ownership of those children. Whereas if it was just a single person, obviously the community would prefer for those members to stay, but if they want to go, okay, that's their business. So yes, the issue of divorce, issue of the status of the family, and I think that it does make a lot of sense that relates to the issue of queer people and how much less tolerance or lack of tolerance there is when it comes to queer members of the Hasidic community. Yeah.
Let me just follow up with a question of my own, because in reading a wide survey of memoir and literature on exiting and family structures that have been disrupted is like the nicest way of putting it. I also notice a real division or like a hierarchy of practice that I wonder if you as sociologists have studied or recognized yourselves. So the first is that men who leave the community do not get their children. Like I don't know a single example, but maybe you do. And women who leave the community have a higher success rate. But if those women come out as gay, they have to there are some stories that are fairly well documented, but it involved very public court cases. And what I see as part of the dynamic that's playing out is a public and kind of American secular dynamic that privileges motherhood, in divorce cases, and kind of like, provides that tension against a Haredi, ultra-Orthodox, or Orthodox community that can mobilize, really intensive resources, legal resources, and so on, to make the case for a paternal control. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I'd love to talk about this. Okay, it's very true that men who leave have a hard time getting their children. But the thing I want to add is men who stay have a hard time getting custody of their children. So in a divorce case where both parents remain Haredi, the status quo, the standard-based in agreement prioritizes the mother for custody. It's a very traditional arrangement. I interviewed, when I was doing my research, I was interviewing people both who stayed Haredi after their divorce and those who left, and some of them shared their custody arrangements with me. So in one case, there was a custody arrangement where the mother got custody of the kids, but custody would be revisited if her ex-husband were to remarry. They both stayed religious, but unless there's a mother in these children's life, the presumption is custody is with the mother. I interviewed fathers who shared that when they got divorced, they had this very loving relationship with their kids. They wanted to maintain that relationship, and people around them looked at them like they were crazy, like almost like that was a sign that there was something even religiously deviant about them, because why would a father want to have so much time with his kids? Like, you don't cook dinner, you don't take care of them, you're not a mother. So there's these very clear gender roles in the Haredi community that you see coming, that really come into play in these divorces. And I think they're only magnified in the Exeter ones because those are the stories we're hearing about. Those are the ones who leave and who talk about it. And on the inside, many people will take these arrangements for granted. Now, this is not the case across the board. Sometimes fathers will get more custody than in other cases. It also depends. Like if a father wants more custody and the mother doesn't care, that's different. But usually, standard, the fathers don't really have that kind of access to the kids in these arrangements.
Wait, I want to go back to the second part of your question.
Yes.
I realized I didn't address it. So it seems to me this is really more anecdotal. I didn't do my own research on this, but I have seen some friends or people on social media that I'm connected to who one parent became publicly ex-Orthodox, and they stayed married to an Orthodox Lubavitch partner. So again, I think statistically this is probably quite rare, but I think it's interesting, even if there's just a few cases of it, because again, thinking of the how things have shifted over the past few decades, at least to me, I can't imagine that kind of arrangement lasting or being acceptable, for any period of time, 20, 30 years ago. So I think that, again, relating to how the ultra-Orthodox community views religious shifts in people's religious identity in general, I think it also impacts families where both partners want to stay in the community, but one of them has publicly come out as no longer Orthodox.
Mm-hmm. And I think it goes also to how individuals also have a certain agency in this sense. We talk always about the community, but also how transformation are making, because as you said, people are speaking out, people are writing, and they're pushing boundaries and making the decision in their own relationship. We can't, there is maybe the authority, but also people at the end of the day, they decide that they make arrangements and they see what they have to lose in case of they're taking this direction or the other one. But I think, to expand on, how is it, because we're talking about all those dynamic, in terms of making decisions in life that are different and that will lead to different type of trajectory for children. How is it different than the rest of society? We're talking about shared custody and motherhood. I mean, it's a very American and acceptance of queerness. I mean, we are in a country where now we have to fight again for abortion, right? So maybe not in New York, but I mean, this is a kind of a very big, just the right to be able to have access. It's not about discussing or, is it right or not, just to have this right. So how is it, different or an American, story in terms of those dynamic? I don't know what you have to say about that, and the acceptance of deviancy, and maybe the how it is called by this Puritanism, American Puritanism. I don't know. I'm going out from.
No. I'm sure everyone has a lot of thoughts. I just want to say, yes, I think that. So the David Myers wrote, and his wife, Naomi Stoltenberg,
Yes.
wrote a wonderful book about Kiryas Joel, one of the two main Satmar communities in New York area, and it's called American Shtetl. And their whole argument is that when we think about Satmar, we should think of this as an American story. That this is not some isolated thing. That they're focusing particularly on sort of how the Satmar community in Kiryas Joel uses the secular courts to maneuver about housing and real estate and all sorts of land use issues, whatever. But I would argue that more broadly, that the kinds of dynamics that we see, the kind of shift to the sort of political, cultural right that we see in the Haredi and the ultra-Orthodox community, it mirrors and is directly related to political shifts that we see in America more broadly. Some scholars talk about how with the last election, when we see the support for Trump in the areas of some areas in Brooklyn and other ultra-Orthodox enclaves was as high or higher than support for Trump in places like Alabama, and that's not a surprise that these things are deeply intertwined. And I think when we think about issues of homophobia and anti-queer sentiment, yes, these are not isolated from the general homophobia and anti-queer sentiment that's prevalent in so much of American society. And I think that it really helps us as analysts to realize the connection between the dynamics that are going on in the ultra-Orthodox community and broader social dynamics that are going on in America. And we could even say globally, there's a rise in the political right all around the world. These dynamics are very, very much interconnected, and we gain in a depth of our understanding when we think about the ultra-Orthodox community in relation to these other broader forces.
So this is such a complex question that you're asking, but just I wanted to offer a few reflections because it's I think a huge topic. I'm not going to touch the Puritans. It's just too big. I think COVID and the period during COVID where communal life was impacted in Jewish communities created a bridge to the Christian right that didn't exist before. And this has been talked about a little bit, but, so if for people who aren't familiar with the dynamic, if you remember, Governor Cuomo forbade religious houses of worship from gathering because public gatherings were considered a public health hazard. And so, especially in Brooklyn and in the ultra-Orthodox communities, but more broadly than that, churches and Shtiblach, they came together. They were united in this understanding that it was intrinsic to their way of life and it was un-American, essentially, and really pushed back. And it created a really interesting and maybe inevitable, partnership between two groups that have a lot of difference between them. And I just want to, because you brought up abortion, enunciate that that's one of the big differences between them. I mean, the pro-life kind of doctrine of the Christian right does not live in the same space that the family values in religious Judaism. I'm being a little broader than just ultra-Orthodoxy. That it lives there. Abortion is permitted. Okay. But yes, I know with guardrails and rules and so on, but it's not nearly as, if you look at the religious right, it doesn't have that same absolute 100% ban. It might be inching towards that. I don't know. But
it seems to me that the difference, there is a difference between the ultra-Orthodox community's attitude towards abortion and the Christian right's attitude, but it's not so much in the details of the permissibility or impermissibility of abortion, although there are some differences. I think the bigger differences is in terms of the order of priorities, that for the Christian right, this is maybe the first, the second, the third, the most important thing that we need to talk about, that we need to focus on. In the Haredi, in the ultra-Orthodox community, there are other things that they might consider, the primary things to focus on. But if you ask ultra-Orthodox Jews in general, do they support abortion or whatever, they say no. I know our colleague, Michal Rauscher, is doing wonderful work on Jewish and even Orthodox support for abortion, but my understanding is that again, there's details, there's sort of specific cases where abortion might be permissible from ultra-Orthodox perspective, but in general, I think the kind of general attitude towards abortion is still very negative, but it's just not as high up on the priorities of the ultra-Orthodox community as it is for the Christian right.
I'm sorry to have, expanded the question related to, how it is, an American story. I'm just going to go back now, maybe to popular representation of ex-Hasidics, the idea of leaving the community, and how the last 10, 15 years, this transformation and potentially the response from different, and the response also from inside, from the community itself, of people, who left the community, and how they saw or they see this, this portrayed, and I see in media, but also through memoirs. So that's the first part of my question. And the second one, just because, Jessica, you just mentioned how now you have new memoirs of queer, different types of family structure that are exposed. What do you see the next step in terms of this corpus of potential literature or portrayal or representation? So on the one hand, the transformation in the last 10, 20 years, and what can we anticipate in terms of the representation?
Yeah, I'll start. I'm going to also, if you don't mind, I'll take it back also to the last question and connect them a little bit, because there's something I wanted to chime in about there. So one piece of this relationship between the Haredi world and the secular American culture is also these points of contact naturally. So you see it in memoirs, you see it in the media, when the stories reach the media, you see it when cases reach the secular courts. You have these forced interactions between these two worlds, and using the tools of the state to negotiate problems in the community, or using the tools of the media to highlight problems in the community or outside of it. And so you end up having this discourse between the two, which is really taking us to your question right here. So I think it also goes back to something that you had brought up a little earlier about, like, something that's really interesting to me is about how this discourse also shapes identities and shapes the people engaged in this discourse. So you have the discourse internally of the Haredi community, the things they tell themselves, the things they print in Mishpacha magazine and places like that, and the changing portrayal of ex-Hasidics that's influenced in part by the media and the things that ex-Hasidics are saying on the outside. There's a lot, when people are talking on the outside, that influences the inside too. They don't want to look bad for the outside world, and it kind of brings a reckoning on the inside as well. And then you even have discourse like the kind that we're having right here, this kind of meta-discourse of how do we understand all these kinds of discourses, and how does that shape our understanding of insiders and ex-Hasidics, and that reaches inside also and outside. I feel like this forum is probably reaching outsiders more than insiders, but it also shapes the way outside, the people who leave the Haredi community look at themselves when you have this kind of meta-discourse happening. So I think this is all part of this larger narrative, but also identity shaping process that's taking place through the give and take.
Not yet, but we're going to get to you. Maybe in a few minutes, we'll shift.
We'll shift.
Yeah, but to address your question, Jessica already noted that so many of the authors of the recent ex-Orthodox memoirs are women, and I would say actually the vast majority of them. That there's literally. It's a relatively small literature, so I don't want to, overemphasize just how significant it is that there's only two people who now identify as male, who are approximately two, who are who have written these memoirs. But basically, the overriding majority are women, and I think it's interesting and I actually spoke to Naomi Seidman about this issue a lot. And one thing that she argued connected to this issue of the secular triumphalism and how these memoirs could feed into a kind of secular narrative against the religion in general and the ultra-Orthodox community in particular. If you think of the ultra-Orthodox community as fundamentally, backwards and problematic, and you look at the people who leave those communities as escapees, people who are managing to escape from this horrible condition, in the sort of secular imagination, who are the most vulnerable population, you could say, oh, these are women. So if you find women who are writing these narratives, it could be seen as the kind of perfect victim to epitomize this horrible condition that they went through. This is not really my theory so much as Naomi's, but I think it is definitely worth thinking about why so many of these narratives are written by women. I think it's interesting, even though, again, we're talking about 12, 14 books in total. I think it's an interesting thing. To go to your second point about where things are headed, obviously it's always hard to say for sure, but I think it is interesting that the most recent ex-Orthodox memoir that I'm aware of is Kissing Girls on Shabbat from Sarah Glass. And that book is about her sort of queer identity and coming to terms with that, but also related to sexual trauma. And she's, I think, a psychologist, and she talks about her therapy practice and helping others come to terms with the traumas that they experienced in the ultra-Orthodox community related to their sexual identity. And I found that recently that Chani Getter, who was on one of the panels yesterday, and she's also coming out with a book that's also related to sexual trauma and healing. And I wonder if this is one of the directions that we might see going forward, not just OTDs or ex-Orthodox people who became therapists or psychologists or deal in a sort of therapeutic way to help the formerly Orthodox, but also people who kind of took their ex-Orthodox experience and then related in some way to helping other people in society. And if this might be one of the sort of new trends going forward.
Thanks. So I would make the case that it's a much larger body of literature than you're making, and I think that's because I define the literature differently. It's really representation, so looking at like every form of representation. Print memoir is probably the most traditional, but thinking about film and online literature and journalistic and all sorts of different forms. And I think you have a really robust literature. Looking forward, I think that we can expect that body to grow, that body of literature and representation to grow. I think we can expect more men to be writing about it, more people documenting narratives that in some ways are more nuanced and different. And I think one of the trends that I've seen recently, and even here at the conference, which I really appreciate, is it came up in the panel I moderated yesterday about the authenticity piece. And it came up in discussion with the Netflix series Unorthodox that I read a number of reviews of Unorthodox, that series that was really popular towards the beginning of the pandemic. There were reviews by people who identified as OTD who were critical of Unorthodox for not elevating the joyful component of Haredi life, that it was such a dreary portrayal of the Haredi community. And it shouldn't, and then that was inauthentic. And I think we're gonna start moving away from some of the more extreme stances. I think this is actually a fairly, standard practice in normalization, and just starting to appreciate the richness of what Haredi and yeshivish and Orthodox communities offer, what they repress, what they don't offer, what they steal from people. But, just understanding that it's a very complex mosaic. That's part of the reckoning of the journey out. So I think that's what I'm looking forward to.
Yeah. I'm just going to add something because this is something that actually in the last chapter of my book, it's called The Public Artist. And, part of the potential transformation and exactly as you said, the critical, voice from inside and trying to transform the narrative, and especially in those, representation on, big screen. The idea of, when you look at cinema of minorities, you always have the voices. Today, you can't have a play without the voices of a minority, right? Speaking out. And it's not enough, if you're writing about Roda to just have, Black person. You need to have, some internal, somebody who's connected to the culture. So I think, expanding on the representation of Jewishness, this is the same thing. Today, it's not enough to say you're Jewish. You need to have also a connection to, the Hasidic world if you want to portray it. And the role of OTD artists, and, we've seen a lot of them, on stage, and maybe writing script, but to really be at the production and I would say behind the camera to really have the power to not only being collaborator, but to be the main character, to write script and to be able to be there. And that's potentially maybe what we can imagine in the future, and also kind of more, as you said, collaboration with people inside and those nuances. And this is a little bit what the women my last chapter is a lot about Melissa Wells and Malky Goldman as well, and I take them as case studies because I follow them closely, and it's very interesting to see their role of wanting to transform the industry itself. And then I'm going to open.
Can I go back just quickly to some?
Yes,
to actually what
and then we'll open the floor to the audience.
I just want to build on what you both were saying. So Jessica expanded from just thinking about the memoir literature to film, and you can even argue activism as well as a kind of a way of using your voice, and activism often makes it to the media. And Zalman had talked about how a lot of these portrayals, you were talking specifically about memoir, but you can expand it, are specifically women's voices, and how he was arguing that it's the consumer, the American consumer, that's pulling these voices out and giving them ear. But something else that you'll notice if you look through this literature is not just that they're disproportionately women. If you look at the memoir literature and the film literature and even the activists across this landscape, they're disproportionately divorcees. They're disproportionately divorced. And now there's a growing movement also toward LGBT. So why are these the voices we're hearing the most? And a big part of this has to do with stigmatization. And there's a whole literature on the relationship between stigma and the way stigma categories, people who are severely stigmatized end up forming sub-communities amongst themselves. In the literature, it's sometimes called oppositional sub-communities that are very vocal. And there's a whole explanation to why they're vocal. In part, it's to validate themselves, to validate their new identity. They find validation in giving voice to who they are and in giving voice to what's wrong with what they left behind. So it makes a lot of sense that the loudest voices are the ones that are the most stigmatized and most marginalized within the Haredi world. And those are the ones we're hearing the most. At a conference a couple years ago, Zalman was actually talking about the distinction between the literature you hear about and his own research. Do you remember that presentation? And he was saying that there's this great discrepancy between what you see in the media, the louder voices, and then what he found in his own research, where most of the experiences were not so extreme and not so devastating as the ones you see. And a lot of this has to do with the self-selection of the people who are going to be speaking up. It's these severely stigmatized people, and those are the stories that we're hearing the loudest.
Sorry, if I could just say one thing. Yes, it's very good of you to remember that discussion. But part of what I was saying there is that it's also, I grant everything that you said. I think that's all true. It's also true that when we think about the most sort of extreme cases in the ex-Orthodox literature, the memoirs and so on, and other forms of literature, which I think are, of course, equally worth studying and thinking about. It's also true that those are sort of the most sensationalist stories. So it's not surprising that the media is either picking up those stories or promoting those stories because sensation, gets people's attention. So I think there's multiple dynamics at work here.
Great. So now we're opening the floor for questions. I'm going to start here. And please, more questions than comments would be really appreciated and short and sweet. Thank you so much.
A few years ago, there was a tragic story of a young woman who committed suicide. I was wondering, has that had an immediate impact with the community, Haredi community, but has there been any long-term impact? Second question, mothers and fathers of OTD children, are any of them able to support their children and ease them from the community and maintain relationships?
So who wants to jump on this?
I can take the suicide. So I think these suicide stories do have a big impact, both in the community of people who leave and among the people who stay. And you see this in like the gatherings that form. There was also a lot of media attention around suicide. And media attention drives change because people don't like when you're telling bad stories about them. So it motivates people to change, to behave differently. There was a suicide in a Hasidic community, in the Belz community, that motivated what I think, was it Zalman or Jessica? One of you had brought up that one Hasidic community had actually, it was Zalman actually, had organized a whole movement to like incorporate the people who leave, and that was in response to a suicide in their community. There was in response, it might be the one that you're thinking of, but there was a lot of media attention after one suicide, and in one of the articles I was reading, and talked about this activist who came to one of these memorial ceremonies. It was led by Exeters, but the activist was actually religious, and he was like making commitments. I want to help promote change on the inside. So there's a lot of discourse. There was a suicide in Israel. Also, it was another divorced mother that said she was from the Ger Hasidic community, where they have really restrictive sexual practices. And the articles that came out about those practices just blew up all over in the U.S. and abroad and in Israel, in the media, that shined a light on those issues. So suicide shines a light on issues because there's a lot of people that speak out when something that harrowing happens, and I do believe it's driving change as well, and you see it in these different little ways. It also drives connections in a surprising way, like with the Belz Initiative, with these memorial groups that are bringing people outside and inside together. So, sometimes you see that happening as well.
Oh, okay. One question at a time, and then if we have time, we go back to your second question. Yes, and then I see, please. Yeah. Two questions. Oh, one question per person. I'm sorry.
Please explain to me, when somebody leaves, all right, you claim that, the person can declare that they are Orthodox. How do they find out the woman is leaving and she's Orthodox? If they find out she's not Orthodox, do they take the children? And also part of that is that if a woman leaves and she's not Orthodox or she's come out as gay, is the court more favorable to the father and the community as far as the children are concerned? What happens with the children?
Sorry, I'm going to take this one as well because it's a divorce question. So you're saying when a woman leaves, how do you know if she's Orthodox or not in those cases? So it gets litigated sometimes, but another piece that comes up is this is a question. Sometimes a couple will get divorced and one spouse will use as a strategy to gain custody allegations against the religiosity of the other partner. So the mother or the father might be fully religious, and one partner will start making allegations that the other partner is not. This came up in a bunch of cases that I was studying, as a ploy to gain custody, because they know Batei Din, the religious courts, will be more favorable to the religious parent, and even secular courts in some cases, in the interest of preserving status quo, will be more favorable to the religious parent sometimes. So it's not consistent, not across the board, but sometimes that's used actually as a strategy. And then sometimes that strategy actually works so effectively that the person who was labeled irreligious down the line is so shunned and marginalized because of that label that they ultimately really leave. So that was something that I saw in a bunch of cases. Yeah, so sometimes one partner, they're getting divorced, will start spreading rumors in the community or in the court that their spouse is not religious. And they'll use that as a way to get custody because they think that the community will rally around them if they think that they're the religious spouse and the other one is not. Or they think the Beis Din will support them, the religious court, if they think that this parent is the religious one and the other one is not. Or they even think that in secular court, they'll have more support in maintaining status quo if they can convince the court that they're religious and the other spouse is not. So sometimes sometimes this label is used against a person who's still religious as a ploy, as a strategy for the other parent to get custody. And sometimes this label is so effective that even if the parent was religious at the outset when she got divorced, because she's now marginalized, there are rumors about her in her community, people don't trust her, people are, supporting her husband, she has no support in the divorce anymore because of this. Down the line, in some of these cases, the person completely left the religion, and you can argue that was a tipping point or a starting point in that process.
Okay, so stop. I'm just going to take one question here, and I'm going to go in the back. Thank you. I see here, but I want to,
Can you hear me?
And please, one question.
So I'll give you one. So I'm curious about the messianic doctrine in the Lubavitch community, that Schneerson is returning as the Messiah. And this is a relatively new doctrine. Is that universally accepted in the Lubavitch community? And if not, is it considered deviancy?
Considered deviant by whom? By the. All right. So this is a good question. Very briefly, for numerous years before Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson, the last Lubavitcher Rebbe, before he passed away in 1994, pretty much all Lubavitchers, by and large, believed that he was the Messiah. After he passed away, then there was sort of shifts where some parts of the community felt were labeled anti-messianists, anti-Mashiachists, and some were labeled Mashiachists or Messianists. But it's very complicated in terms of what the actual attitudes of the Lubavitchers are, because some people argue, and I think there's a lot of justice with this argument, a lot of validity to it, that many Lubavitchers across this supposed line actually believe in their heart of hearts that the Lubavitcher Rebbe is still the Messiah, that there will be a resurrection of the dead, and he will come back and be the Messiah. It's just that they think that it's bad for publicity to say that because, just people think it sounds weird, but also some people think it sounds very much like the Christian belief in the return of Jesus. So it's hard to pin down exactly what they believe in. As Miriam has been noting, that there's a lot of complicated relationships between the inside of these ultra-Orthodox communities and how they're represented to the outside world, and how news stories about them, let's say, influence people on the inside. And Lubavitch in particular is very media savvy, and they're very aware of what the popular media is saying about them and how it might impact other people's attitudes towards them. And since Lubavitch is interested in Jewish outreach and in being connected to non-Orthodox Jews all around the world, they're especially concerned about their popular image. So it's a little hard to know exactly what all the Lubavitchers believe, but definitely there are some Lubavitchers today that still believe that the Rebbe is the Messiah or will be the Messiah.
Okay. And is there any? Yes, one. And I'm sorry if I don't take all the questions. I try my best, but the hands are coming at the same time.
So my question is about, you were talking more about the gray area that has sort of grown in the community for people who were previously considered deviants, and now sort of there's space being made for them in the community. I'm curious about not just the space that's made for them, but the sort of public space that's made for them, so sort of institutions. So what I'm noting from the community, that there aren't really schools for people like that, but there are minyanim, there are shuls, maybe people are speaking publicly on podcasts, but I'm curious about whether there are more institutions, or there may be in the future, 5 years down the line, there might be schools for people like that. And I'm particularly also interested in, because I see where a lot of that gray space is sort of an age range of people who like, they're out of the system, they've finished school, but they're not getting married. And so they're kind of out of the pipeline. And so it's kind of people in their late 20s, early 30s. And so there's this whole, like the gray space tends to be of that demographic. So I'm curious if you have any thoughts or comments on that. Or like institutions, like the question is more like, do you see any institutions that are being built or that will be built for that sort of gray space?
There are some institutions like that. You're right, there's probably not enough, but it seems like there's a recognition that there's a need. So like there are organizations that help. There are some specifically for girls, teens, you know, who are like going off that kind of catch them and give them, I don't remember the name of it, like something place or something home. Does that do our place? Yeah, there are a couple like that. Some for girls, some for boys. There's also there are yeshivas that are more moderate that try to catch those students and to like reinstill the love of learning, but in a more moderate way, not as intense for the ones who are feeling alienated by the learning culture. So it seems like there's a recognition for this need and a growing movement to fill them, but not yet. I don't think it's fully there yet, which is why it's a question you can raise now, or not as visible enough yet, you know? So it seems like the community is recognizing the need and moving to fill that need. And I guess we'll see over the next decade how it takes off or not.
If I could just add to that, though, again, I think we need to be very careful about what exactly we're talking about. So I remember like 20 years ago, I finished yeshiva. I didn't have a high school diploma. I wanted to get a GED, and I ended up taking a GED like prep course that was offered through the city of New York, but it was hosted by an Orthodox organization or program that was for quote unquote at-risk youth. Now, at that point, the only thing I was really at risk of was going to college. But you know, this program was designed for these troubled teens, and it was very interesting. Like the physical space, we were in some kind of bunker-like structure, under subterranean structure, and they were like spray painted on the walls. Like it was supposed to be, I don't know, this sort of cool type of thing. There's a pool table or whatever, but clearly the intent of the program was to save these troubled youth and get them back to be Orthodox. They weren't making a space for ex-Orthodox. They were trying to get ex-Orthodox people to become Orthodox. So I'm not saying that there are no programs that have, let's say, I don't know, more benevolent or open-minded motivation. But I think we need to be very clear when we're talking about the Orthodox or ultra-Orthodox community, when they're making programs, when they're designing programs, are they designing them in order to recapture or reconnect with their members or former members, in order to get them to do kiruv, to do outreach on them, to persuade them to come back to the community? Or are they creating spaces that are truly open and accepting of people wherever they are and wherever they, you know, plan on going in the future?
Yeah, and without necessarily presenting them as at risk.
And I think he's hit on a real need, actually, if you think about this, that you have different motivations inside the community, different motivations of organizations outside for exiters who leave the community, and there's this growing fluidity and identity of the people who like kind of leave but kind of stay, and we do need new spaces that can embrace both sides of that identity.
Okay, I see a lot of hands, but we have to close. I'm really sorry, but you have the chance maybe to discuss now that the panel is over. Thank you so much for this wonderful panelists, and was great.